I want to interview the Liberal Senator from Western Australia, Linda Reynolds, who's been hot on the tail of Gillian Triggs in Senate committee hearings. Thanks for joining us again, Linda.
Good evening. Thanks, Chris.
Look, before we get on to Gillian Triggs and other matters in the Senate, I want to get your reaction to that interview just now with Mike Henry of BHP Billiton. He doesn't do a lot of interviews in general media, a man whose day job is so important to this country. Fascinating to hear that when you're talking about such massive export earners as iron ore exports and coal exports in this country and our uranium and gold exports, that he's saying that obviously BHP Billiton are extremely concerned about this plan to increase tax on iron ore in Western Australia. And in South Australia, with their Olympic Dam expansions still in the wind over the coming decade, they're obviously highly concerned about the unreliability and cost of energy in South Australia.
Look, Chris, I heard what he had to say, and I think he's got every right to be concerned. And accordingly, I think every Australian should be very concerned. So the two issues here are, first of all, the WA, the Brendan Grills mining tax, which I think is just economic lunacy. So not only are we putting a flat tax on two of our biggest, not only our biggest taxpayers, but also we're doing it at a time when they can least afford it. And it will cost jobs. And one of the many crazy things about this tax, and I will concede it is very good politics, is that it will be imposed whether the company is profitable or not. So we export about 40% of iron ore internationally, and we're already the second highest taxed. So what this would do is put us over the edge and make us the most expensive iron ore producer in the world. And we've got competitors chomping at the bit. It's mad.
And in South Australia, where they're desperate for jobs, desperate for economic progress, where they have one major mine in the north of the state which is reliant on electricity, they black out and they have the most expensive power in the country. How are you going to get investment in this country if we can't get these basics right?
Well, we're simply not, because money, as you know, goes all around the world. And if we cannot provide here in Australia in the 21st century energy security, then I'm not surprised that BHP and other companies are worried. But as I said, every Australian should be worried, because BHP is the biggest federal taxpayer in this country.
All right, well, let's get on to your work in the Senate Estimates Committees, where you've been pursuing a number of issues over a long period, over a couple of years. But with the criticism of Gillian Triggs that's come from me and from others, and certainly from politicians in the Estimates Committees, it's often been portrayed as people bullying Gillian Triggs. And I think it's important to get you on, because what you've been doing is going through some very forensic questioning of her, repeated episodes of misleading or incorrect evidence to Senate committees. Surely it's time that she resigns as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission if she can't actually turn up at a committee just one time and not give incorrect evidence.
Well, Chris, none of us in government, whether we're a part of the executive as she is, whether the judiciary or also in Parliament, we are all accountable. And Professor Triggs is just as accountable as any other person paid for by the taxpayer. And I certainly haven't been bullying. I've been doing my job. And my job as a senator appointed to this committee is to ask her the tough questions. And when it is clear that she's giving contradictory evidence, or her questions lead to more questions, then I would be derelict in my duty, my responsibility to taxpayers, not to prosecute these questions further. Should
she resign?
I believe she should definitely consider her situation. And it's not for me to call for her resignation. However, clearly now she has, on this occasion, she has clarified the record of what we asked her, but we are recalling her now because there are a lot of other questions that she was unable to answer or unwilling to answer in relation to her, what I see as a position as an activist. Now, I personally find it irreconcilable that you have someone who is an activist, a very public and vociferous activist, on an issue that she's inquiring into on behalf of the government. And I think that is a question that all Australians need answered.
How many times, by your reckoning, has she misled or given incorrect evidence to Senate committee hearings?
Multiple occasions now. So I've sat in on two separate hearings, and on both occasions she has given evidence that has been highly contradictory and, if not, incorrect. So
therefore, couldn't the government sack her? Don't they have enough reason to say that she's misbehaved in her role and she should be sacked?
Well, look, I'm going to reserve my opinion until we see her the next time, because we are recalling Professor Triggs. But if I was Professor Triggs, I would certainly be looking at the tenability of my position.
Well, let's just have a look at one exchange between yourself and Professor Triggs most recently, earlier this month, just to give you an idea of how all this has unfolded.
So you were quoted as saying in the interview that a shocking phenomenon is Australians don't even understand their own democratic system. They are quite content to have Parliament be complicit with passing legislation to strengthen the power of the executive and exclude the courts. They have no idea of the separation of powers and the excessive overreach of executive government. I assume you are correctly quoted in that?
I don't have access to the interview on which that edited piece was written.
Professor Triggs, this record also says, and not that you said it, I knew I could have responded and destroyed then. I could have said, you asked me a question that demonstrated you've not read our statute. How dare you question what I do? Do you recall saying that to the journalist?
No, I don't, and I believe that was something that was put in by the sub-editor.
Gillian Triggs there, she said none of this stuff, and then of course she said that all this is accurate because a tape recording turned up. How are you going to resolve this with her?
Well, there are clearly a lot more questions to answer, because at that same hearing there was also a number of other occasions where we quoted from her in the public arena, and on multiple occasions she either couldn't recall saying it or was misquoted, or when I asked, she couldn't even recall or wouldn't say that that was actually her position at all. So I think there is a long way to go yet in terms of just pinning down what she stands for. But Chris, I would point out in that piece of footage you showed there is that not only did she show great contempt for the average Australian and their intellect, but in the same hearing she also was highly critical of High Court judges. She was contemptuous of all politicians, and she's also quoted there, which is one of the things she wouldn't actually pin down whether she was accurately quoted or not, is she was horrendously rude about government lawyers. So it doesn't leave too many, the judiciary, the executive and
the public,
parliamentarians
and the politicians, they're all wrong. Gillian Triggs is the only one who's right.
I was left wondering who she does have any respect for.
Well, maybe the Solicitor General, because I wanted to go on to, you've been involved in pursuing the Solicitor General, Justin Gleeson, who has now resigned. Now, again, the standard media take on this was that he was bullied by George Brandis, and perhaps it should have been Brandis that went. But Justin Gleeson is a man who obviously has strong Labor Party connections, was appointed by the Labor Party, then went and actually had a secret conversation with Labor during the election campaign that he didn't tell the Attorney-General about. He went to his daughter's book launch, which you would do, but a highly politicised book launch where Julian Burnside called for the ministers, two of the ministers in the government he worked for, to be put on trial for crimes against humanity. I mean, he had become highly politicised himself, hadn't he?
Well, certainly from what I heard from him during that inquiry, that was the opinion I came to. But I then asked him questions because he fessed up during that hearing that none of us knew about before, that he had actually breached the caretaker conventions by not only taking a call from the Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, but also answering his questions. And the answers he provided, I think, were privileged information that he had provided to the government.
They were his advice to the government, and he told the opposition.
Absolutely.
And he didn't tell the government that he told the opposition.
For the Solicitor General to not know that he should have just hung up the phone, got on to the Secretary of the Department or the Attorney General and just say, look, I've had this approach from the Shadow Attorney General, you know, what do I do about it?
It must do your head in at times, though, when you reveal this information in Senate committees and then you see the way it's reported in the media as if somehow the Solicitor General is the victim.
Yeah, and so I put 34 questions on notice as a result of his additional questions, which my left-wing Twitter followers have basically accused me of being the biggest bully ever, and I'm simply doing my job. They are absolutely follow-on questions, and I think they still need to be answered.
Yep. And we're yet to see whether he will deign to answer them.
Well, he's actually said that he won't answer them, so I'm now putting back, and the committee, which is Labor majority have agreed that he doesn't need to answer them, which again is something quite extraordinary because my questions were not extraordinary at all and they were directly relevant. So I'm going to have another crack at it this week to see if he could answer some more questions.
Well, good on you, Linda Reynolds. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming in. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Chris.
Senator Linda Reynolds. That's all she's doing is asking questions of public officials. We wouldn't mind getting the answers occasionally, and the right answers at that too. Back in a moment with the